Special Operations, Covert Ops, Espionage, The Team House, with your hosts, Jack Murphy and David Park.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 216 of The Team House. I'm Jack Murphy. Dave Park is all the way on the other side of the set today. And we have two guests in studio tonight. We're really happy to have returning to the show Justin Sapp and Toby Harnden. Toby is the author of First Casualty, a book about the CIA paramilitary team that Justin Sapp was assigned to at that time. He was a Green Beret with Special Forces assigned to the agency paramilitary team that J.R. Seeger was in charge of. We have had him on the show before, awesome guy. So we've had you two on the show independently, but never together. So we're really excited to have you both here, in person.
Yeah, exactly. It was on Zoom last time. So
Yeah.
I love the new studio.
We had Justin in our old studio when it was a little more haphazard. I mean, this is pretty haphazard, but
no, this is great. Thanks for having us back.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, man. I really appreciate it.
Well, we found it because we bumped into you bringing out the trash. So
that was hilarious. Yeah, I was bringing out the trash to throw out, and I pushed open the door, and these two guys are standing right, walking by.
Literally, we just walked up, but it looked like we were standing there.
I mean, the camouflage netting on our door outside should give us away.
The NRA bumper stickers.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So you've both been on the show, and we've had your origin stories. But for people who haven't had the opportunity to watch those yet, can you guys kind of give us a rundown on, like who you are and a little, a bit of backstory?
Sure. Well, so I'm obviously, you can tell from the accent, not originally from these parts, originally from
the South,
the UK.
Oh, the UK,
the north of England. Although I haven't got a particularly north of England accent. My dad was in the Navy. We moved around a lot when I was a kid. I joined the Navy, got a sponsorship through college, studied modern history, then went back into the Navy, spent sort of 10 years in total, and after that became a journalist. Got posted to Northern Ireland pretty early on, and it was kind of a transition really from domestic reporting to sort of being a foreign correspondent. From there I got sent to Washington, which was where I was on 9/11, getting a little bit bored with covering just politics, and eventually wound up, like so many other people, in Iraq, then Afghanistan. I wrote a book about a British battle group in Helmand in 2009. I'd already written a book about the IRA called Bandit Country, which is actually about to be reissued, I think, probably in November. So I was running the sort of journalism and books alongside each other. I went back to Washington. I covered way too much American politics and presidential campaigns, and then 2021, I guess it was in the end. I wrote First Casualty, my third book, which was about really centered on CIA's Team Alpha, the first team behind enemy lines after 9/11, and that got me, in contact with people like Justin, and the rest is history.
That's fantastic.
Well, thanks for having me back. I'm Justin Sapp. I been in career in the Army. I've been in the Army over 28 years, and I'm getting ready to retire soon. I started out as the son of a CIA officer. So we moved around the world, mainly in the Middle East and South Asia. And we came back when I was a senior or junior in high school, graduated in Atlanta, and I went to university in Virginia Military Institute. Took a commission in the Army. Went in armor initially, and then I ended up going to Special Forces. I was in a very cool unit in the 82nd called 373 Armor, Airborne Tank Battalion. My understanding is they're back now, not with tanks, but they're back as a unit. And from there I went to the Q course and all that training that goes into the pipeline, and then I went to 5th Special Forces Group. And I was there as a team leader in 1st Battalion, had a great time. I was on an ASOT team, an urban UW team is the term they used at the time. did some deployments, did a JSET to Uzbekistan, deployments to Kuwait, this sort of thing, and then 9/11 happened. And I was at combat diver course in Key West when 9/11 happened. When I came back to group, obviously things had changed, and then I was one of 3 individuals picked to join the Central Intelligence Agency and deploy to Afghanistan, which is the subject of First Casualty. That whole story is related in there by Toby. He does a very good job of that. And I came back, and like many of you, I spent the balance of my career in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Middle East. And now I'm here in New York. I'm actually the military advisor of the U.S. Ambassador to the UN, and I work for the Joint Staff. And I'm looking forward to retiring here in the near future.
That's fantastic. After your time, because I mean, First Casualty, if you guys haven't read it, everybody needs to read it. It's a fantastic book.
Thank you.
It's a fantastic account. I mean, and you had a lot of access, right?
Well, yes, but it wasn't like somebody saying, "Here, we're opening the doors. Come in, and you've got access." It was sort of painstakingly built up, and I remember vividly. You know, it was probably about 3 years or so ago. Meeting Justin for the first time. Now, we'd been in email contact around about 2013, 2014 when I first got interested in the subject. But we met outside a sandwich shop. It was the height of COVID. And, we were sitting outside this place. And Justin started talking about what he was doing on 9/11. And so not only was he at the school in Key West, but he was underwater, when the first plane hit. And so he was just telling me the story, and I just remember sitting there thinking like, wow, okay, so there's the opening to the book, because I knew that David Tyson was in the air flying from Tashkent to London. I knew that Mike Spann was on the ground at CIA headquarters, and now had somebody who was underwater. And the other thing I remember about that is it went way, way, way longer than we planned.
You're saying that Justin talked way too much?
So Justin said to me, so he was in full flow, and I'm just like lapping it all up. And obviously I've got my tape recorder on. I'm thinking this is just fantastic. And he says, he stops and says, "Hey, I'm not giving you too much detail up, am I?" And I was like, "No, you are not giving me too much detail." And so it was really a process of going from person to person, from Team Alpha and also Green Berets, people like Mark Mitchell, people from ODA 595, Brits from the SBS, Special Boat Service, like the British SEALs. And, I was coming into it pretty cold. I mean, I'd been a foreign correspondent for a long time, spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan, and, and I had a couple of books under my belt, but they were British books, basically. So I was pretty unknown quantity. And so it's just a process of just showing up, doing your homework, doing all of the background reading, and just winning people over, in the hope that they will say to the next person, well, this guy, you're not going to waste your time if you're talking to him. He seems like the real thing. He's knowledgeable. He's respectful. He's fully invested in this, and so that's where the sort of access came from. Really, it was. I felt there was a sort of a tipping point. After speaking to David J.R. Seeger, who you mentioned, who was writing thrillers, so I read his thrillers and went and interviewed him about the thrillers and said, and by the way, I'd also like to talk about this because I'm thinking about doing a book. So David Tyson, who had just retired and I'd been pursuing for years, really about 7 years, and finally agreed to talk to David, Justin, and JR. Then it became more difficult because there were people who'd been senior, very senior, like Scott Spellmeyer, who was Kabul station chief and the senior CIA guy on the NSC at the end of his career, just retired, people contracting. And so at that point, I knew I had enough to write it, and I went to the agency and said, hey, I'm doing this. And they're like, yes, we already know. And I said, if you can give me, if you can sort of vouch for me, give me access, allow people who are still serving to speak to me, that will be much appreciated. And they did help. They did facilitate a number of interviews. And so, I mean, it's interesting. Andy Hartzog, who was just Andy in the book with a bar over his eyes. I interviewed Andy. It was COVID, so it was on the phone. but they facilitated that, even though he was a serving officer, and he's since retired. Just very recently, his cover's being lifted, so he's sort of out in the open.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So that's how the sort of access came about, and I'm now working on another book as well as doing other things, including editing AARP Veteran Report newsletter, which we'll talk about later. But it's another CIA-related project, and I look at First Casualty as, I guess, in a way, me introducing myself to the agency and the community and that sort of readership, and hopefully it's a pretty good building block.
Justin, what was it like? I don't know if you had journalists and authors reach out to you prior to this, but how did Toby come on your radar, and what were your initial thoughts?
Well, that's a good question. So I think initially, Toby had met with a fairly senior individual that had been in my unit, Mark Mitchell, who was at the time working at the NSC, and he had recommended told Toby, hey, Justin Sapp may be a good person to talk to. So if I recall, like 2013, we established contact by email or on the phone, and we chatted a bit. And so I went to the PAO folks or whoever the contact was. I think Jerry gave me the email, and I went to the agency and I said, hey, look, I've been contacted by this individual who's interested in writing a book. I'm mindful of the security concerns, and the fact that it's still classified, etc. Although I'm told that maybe there's an opportunity to tell the story here, and I never heard back. And then fast forward until, was it 2020?
Yeah.
2021, I can't remember. We established contact, and then you were up in the New Jersey area where I live, and then we met at that restaurant, and then we a deli, and we had a chat that lasted quite a while. So that's really how it unfolded. I think there's a couple of years that intervened, and then we reestablished contact and went from there.
It's a really interesting process because you're total strangers, but you're talking about stuff that becomes quite intimate, and people are placing a lot of trust in you, and at the same time, you want to encourage people to talk, but you want to be kind of true to them and true to their story, and so you want to persuade them that you are without being fake. Mm-hmm. And so it really is a sort of a process. And then one of the things that I found interesting about this is it's sort of continued, really, because it's through the publication of the book, and so there's a level in trust with giving people access to drafts and stuff, and I gave Justin a draft, and at a certain point, and that's for me, for any writer, it's just you don't like to do that, but at the same time you don't want to make any mistakes, and sometimes you can inadvertently sort of reveal something or touch on something that's very sensitive, or you can just get small details wrong, and so it becomes, there's an element of collaboration about it where, Justin had a number of things like, that's right, that's just a little bit off, or I think that was this person, not that person. And so, it's interesting. And then because of what happened in Afghanistan, which again, I'm sure we'll talk about in August 2021, which was just before publication, I think what happened with the research of the book is the sort of team starts to get back together, back in contact, because the story is sort of being told. And then obviously what happened in Afghanistan in August 2021 happened, and then there's sort of a new mission, if you like, and a new phase. And so I've continued with Team Alpha and others to get to know them even better since the book was initially published. And I did an epilogue which was about the start of helping the Afghan allies and the collapse in August 2021, which wasn't covered in the book because it had gone to press before then. So it's really interesting. It's not just like a sort of a fire and forget where you just do the interview, you write your thing, and then you move on. It's sort of much more sort of ongoing.
One of the things that we know, like memory under trauma or memory under stress, like everybody has like different memories of an operation just because of like an assault or whatever, because that's sort of what our brains do. Were there like times when guys were like, were there? I don't want to say disagreements, because that seems like it's disagree. But when people's facts were different, just because of
remember
the
it
stress,
differently.
yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, with anything, I don't know, a discussion you had with your significant other at sort of breakfast today.
Like every day, yeah,
Yes.
right.
there might be different perspectives on what was, not only what was meant and what was felt, but what was actually said. And so, as Jack says, if it's a very traumatic incident or a very kind of significant incident, then I guess that factor of memory and perspective is sort of magnified sort of hundreds of times. And so, I mean, I was constantly trying to sort of, I remember, in the Navy navigating, you have like 3 cross lines, and where they meet is where you are, and you're always trying to cross-reference and to work out what happened. And then, obviously, if you get documents, which I did, like David Tyson's diary, for instance, some other documents, that really, really helps, because that's, more sort of reliable in terms of timelines. And then, it becomes not just a sort of a process of interviewing, but also a process of discussion. I might say to, Justin, Justin has an incredible memory for sort of facts, and also even sort of dialogue, and so actually Justin was a huge resource. But I might say, Dave said this, and Scott said that, and you said that. What do you think? And then you sort of tease it out, and but there's some things you can't ever really get to as to exactly.
I was gonna ask, were there times where you were ready to just like throw this manuscript across the room because you're like going through it again and going through it again and going through it? And I mean, I know how difficult that it is to write a book like this.
I don't think I ever got to that stage, but you do get to a stage where it feels sort of overwhelming,
right?
And you can never, and also you have a deadline. You have to get this, because I could still be writing this, and there's still, even after publication, very occasionally I'll hear something, I think, that would have been a good line,
Right.
I wish I'd had that.
Right.
But thankfully nothing sort of huge. But yeah, I mean, it's frustrating, but it's more exhilarating, because the further into it you get, the more it starts to
Coalesce,
the pieces.
yeah.
The pieces sort of start to fit together, and you're like, yes, and sometimes there'll be something that I didn't understand fully to quite a advanced stage, and then I'll be like, now I know. So I'd say it's more exhilaration than frustration ultimately.
But I think you reached out a lot to confirm things. I mean, there was a constant sort of azimuth check there. I remember you would text me and you'd ask for, hey, what was this? What's that? And you were not only cross-referencing my memory with other people's and validating it or just checking it, but also other details, which in our community amongst military guys, SF guys, we're notorious for being critical about accuracy, technical accuracy and all that. And so when I eventually saw your manuscript, which is great, there's just a couple little things, and I thought, well, at first I wasn't going to say anything, and then I thought, no, it's important, because it's just the type of people who are going to read this.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them are going to go, okay, the Draeger, for example,
Yeah.
is worn on your chest, not on your back. Little subtle things like that. Like when we watch war movies, you go,
Right.
oh, that's not accurate. That enhances things, and so that was, I think, important. And you were very mindful of that and the details.
I can imagine how some of those conversations must have been with JR, who's literally like a walking encyclopedia of paramilitary operations.
Yeah. And also JR's, as he once said to me himself, that you have a conversation with JR and he'll start talking about the formation of the Earth and the alignment with the planets.
It's important to understand.
And the great and by the time you get to the great game in Afghanistan, you may be talking for an hour already. So
we're talking about like Albania in 1957. And I'm like, well,
But Justin, like what you said is very accurate, especially for a large part of the audience of this book, is that when somebody from the military community reads a book, and if there's one thing like that's out of place, like where a Draeger is located on the body. If that's wrong, then people go, well, how
What
do I
else is
know
wrong?
anything else in this
Yeah.
book
Right.
is
Yeah.
accurate? Like what else is accurate? Yeah, it's really it's very important.
And that's why, I mean, that's why it's important for me to do it. And I also think that if I don't understand, on the, beyond the detail, if I don't understand something, then the reader's probably not going to understand it.
Right.
And certainly if I write it and I don't understand it, the reader certainly isn't going to understand it. And I mean, I was very appreciative of the amount of time and effort people from Team Alpha, and Justin and David and the others would spend on helping me to get things right. So
Let's take a quick pause here. We got to give a shout out to our sponsor for this show, which is the AARP Veteran Report. And so I have all the talking points here, but I feel kind of stupid telling you what those are. Do you want to tell us, Toby, since you write for it, what is the AARP Veteran Report?
So sure. So I am a contractor at AARP, and I'm the senior editor of this newsletter, which we launched last August, and it's for veterans. It is what it says on the tin, and it goes out twice a month, second and the fourth Thursday of the month, and it's a mixture of sort of human stories. Justin wrote for it last week about Badger 6, and it was actually one of our regular features, which is then and now. So somebody back in the day. So we've done ones from Vietnam, and we've even done one World War II one. But in this case, it was Justin back in 2001, and Justin now. He was a captain in his late 20s. He's now a colonel in his early 50s, I guess, and a new mission. So it's connected. So the point is connecting what you're doing now with your service, and Justin actually is still serving, about to be a veteran. And so that was about Badger 6 and the new mission to rescue Afghan allies. We have a feature called My Hero, where it's somebody talking about the service of a veteran. It might be a Gold Star spouse, it might be the daughter of a veteran, it might be a parent of a veteran, or a brother of somebody who received the Medal of Honor in Vietnam and was killed. And so there's that kind of human story. But then there's service stories about discounts and benefits and how to navigate VA healthcare. And so we found, we've got, I think the last time I looked, it was, almost 70,000 subscribers.
Wow.
And so we find that the mix is successful, that you don't want all of just one thing. And so, 700-word articles, it's an email newsletter, so you can, most people read it on their phones. It's not in print. And you don't have to be an AARP member to subscribe. It's free to subscribe. But it's also a way to get veterans to tap into AARP resources.
Right. Some of the things we were talking about, because I'm a member of AARP, and I didn't know that there was a veterans discount for AARP.
I think I've seen 43%.
That's amazing. And so if you go to AARP, is it AARP.org? .org /vet report. You don't even have to be a member to subscribe. So everybody watching now should subscribe. They don't spam you. It's just the articles. And they're great stories, human interest stories, and particularly if you're interested in the military.
Yeah. And it's for veterans, but also families of veterans, people who support the military. It's got a kind of a generally sort of upbeat sort of vibe. I sort of feel it's like patriotic, but it's not rah-rah.
Right.
It's human, some quite sort of sentimental stories about people just discovering the sort of war letters, World War II letters written by their parents, but it's not cheesy. So I write for it sometimes. I did a story about war dogs, canine heroes recently, and we have a whole bunch of freelancers, many of them veterans. So I like it because I feel it's meaningful. It sort of helps people. I've covered a lot of negative stuff in the news business in my time. This is positive, and I'm always finding stories, telling stories, helping people tell stories from some incredible people that I otherwise, might not have contact with.
That's fantastic.
Check out aarp.org/vet report. You can sign up for it. And I also want to give a quick shout out to our Patreon. The link's down in the description. If you guys go down there and help support the show, it starts just $5. You will get access to all the episodes of the Team House ad-free. So please help us out. We really appreciate all you guys who subscribe to our Patreon. And please make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel too if you haven't already.
We're on that march to 100,000.
We're getting there.
Hey, we should have a competition. We're on for 100,000 as well.
Really? You guys, how long have you been working on this?
Since so we launched last August. So
Okay,
about
we've
10
been
months.
working 3 years, so we think we know who's going to get there first.
Okay.
Justin, can you, we talked about it on your show, but a lot of people maybe, haven't had the opportunity to see the show. Can you tell us about your introduction to Team Alpha, how it was formed, and like?
Yeah, that's an interesting story. So it was very, in my view, kind of ad hoc, and it was in extremis, right? So I graduated dive school on, I think it was 20 September, and I believe that was a Friday. I got back to group, and the next morning was a Saturday, the 21st, and Colonel Mulholland told me, hey, there's 3 of you going to go, and you're going to be detailed to the CIA, and you're going to conduct an unconventional warfare assessment and get to it, get busy. And we left the following Monday, if I recall. And anyway, we got to headquarters. We got to Special Activities Division. We got a quick in-brief, and I didn't know anybody. I mean, I had interned there in college in DI, the Director of Intelligence, but it was, a totally different kind of world there. So I didn't know any of these folks, and so we were sort of kind of felt a little bit, I don't know, like outsiders, and we kind of stayed out of everybody's way for a couple days. And then eventually we got introduced to members of the team, but it wasn't like, here's the team, and there was 6 of us or 7 of us there. It was sort of here and there. I met Alex Hernandez, I met Mike Spann, but I didn't know that they were going to be on my team because things were so heady at the time and in such a state of flux, at all levels, all the way to the National Command, that we didn't know who was going where and what teams. Alex, I think, knew a little bit more, but things were being formed on the fly. And so we, at one point, went from being last or close to last in the order of march to being first or second in the order of march. And so some people know, the NALT team went in, before us into the Panjshir Valley, and then we quickly followed. But our team, and the fact we were going to link up with Abdul Rashid Dostum, I didn't know that we were going to link up with Dostum until we arrived in Afghanistan. Now, I think Alex knew and a couple other people knew, but I literally was so fixated on getting my stuff together, getting to the packed, and then we literally got in a van outside of CIA headquarters, and we drove to the point of departure, got on the aircraft, and then we flew to Uzbekistan. And the first time I met everybody, with the exception of Dave, because we picked up Dave in Tashkent at the embassy, was in that van headed to the airport. And so that was my entree, that was my introduction to everybody. And that's not the way it's supposed to work, but at the time, it was, it was a different time. I mean,
right.
It was like go, go, go. And I don't know what else could have been done. I mean, it was a different time, it was an extreme situation. And so we got to talk and we got to know each other in the flight over there. And then we had a couple days, 2 or 3 days in Tashkent where we staged out of the warehouse there. And that was all day, together, maps and radios, putting radios together. We had the new embitters, the SAT-capable weapons, all that kind of stuff. And so by the time we got to Karshi-Khanabad, I had a pretty good feeling. I mean, everybody was prior military. So there was that bond there, this sort of vet bond, that prior service bond. It seemed really natural to me. And that was, I don't think that was typical. I realized they picked some really good guys for this. So that's how I got to know everybody, and then we infilled shortly thereafter.
You gave Dave Tyson a famil on the AK-47, which
Yeah.
I've never.
Well, Dave, so I didn't know everybody had been in the military, and Dave had been in the military, but Dave, I had actually met when I went on a joint combined exchange training in May and June and July of that same year. So I'd just been in Uzbekistan a couple months before. I had actually instantly met Dave. He gave me a ride to the embassy, picked up some people at the hotel. I didn't know who he was for sure, but he like, I kind of
Got a vibe.
I just got a vibe, and my dad was an agency guy, so I just kind of knew. But it would have been long since forgotten. And then he shows up, and they introduce him as, hey, he works the station here, and I'm like, wait a minute, you look familiar. And then we figured it out. He had given me a ride to the airport, and we went. One of the days we were there, we had to do the fanfare, so we took these AKMSs down to what I think was a parking garage that had been converted into an indoor range. So it sort of went down to the ground. So it was impossible for any stray rounds to fly out. And we did a fanfare in the basement with the AKs and the Glocks. And then Dave had a Browning high power, I remember that. And we did that, and wasn't the most, like no ventilation or whatever nowadays. And we did that, and then we left, and then it was just one thing after the other. But you were so excited about being part of this mission that you didn't really think about. Everything was new and exciting, right?
Yeah.
So it was different. It was a different time, and a lot of people who were adults during 9/11 and remember it, the atmosphere, the zeitgeist in the States was totally different than it is nowadays.
Right.
You know what I mean? It
Yeah,
really was.
It was very much like, let's get some.
Yeah.
Take the gloves off.
Yep.
Connect
No
the
time,
dots,
no
all that.
patience for excuses. I
Yeah.
mean, you're all in or not.
Now, were there discussions at your level or higher that you know of about follow-on forces, conventional forces, like how, so you've got this small team of Americans who are basically charging a country.
So the plan was, as it was briefed initially, it was all broad conceptual. When we first got to headquarters, I was brought in, I was told a couple things. One is, you no longer work for the Army, you work for us, because that's the whole Title 50 thing. So that was very clear. I said, fair enough. And then the second thing was, hey, we're going to try to get you in to link up with this array of warlords. So they had Ishmael Khan, they had Dostum, and they had a map with the pictures of these guys. But it wasn't explicitly stated which one you're going to. So that was kind of, I was like, okay, we're putting this plan together. Like, it's still, like, not, it's in the oven getting baked. There was no discussion about conventional follow-on forces. I assumed that there would be some sort of airfield seizure at some point, because that would be logical, right? But that was not discussed. What was discussed was, you're going in, you're going to do an unconventional warfare assessment, then you're going to come out after 2 weeks, which was roughly doctrinal, right? So that's what a pilot team would do. To me, I was like, okay, this is familiar. This is a pilot team operation. But that changed quickly when we got to Uzbekistan. The timeline got compressed to the point where it went from a week to 4 days to 3 days. And so what do you okay, fine, it's not doctrinal, whatever, let's roll with it. But yeah, that was the plan. But what was crazy about it was some of the discussions about how we were going to get into Afghanistan at the time. At one point, they talked about flying off the carrier into southern Afghanistan wearing burqas. They had an idea to smuggle us in vehicles that people had contacts with these folks that had hidden compartments. So we would be somehow smuggled into Uzbekistan in these vehicles and then driven, across northern Afghanistan to link up with Dostum. And then the agency was going to fly us in, and then they realized, well, wait a minute, we have these MH-60s that are here for CSAR, along with 47s. Let's ask CENTCOM, General Franks, to use those. And they did, and that was approved after a couple days. So the actual delay was associated with that request.
Can you imagine doing 400 miles in a cutout in a Jenga truck over Afghan roads?
But to give you an example,
Take your Dramamine.
Yeah.
I was
And I think
trying
swimming
to
across the
imagine.
river was part of it at one point.
Well,
as well.
or
Or at least going on a barge or something.
because the Termes Bridge was blocked. It looked like the Maginot Line when I went there. It all these obstacles and stuff, and they had ferries that would ferry people across the Amu Darya River. So my understanding was these vehicles would have to be ferried across and then disembarked.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah.
Nothing. Yeah, right. But at the time, we were like, okay, cool.
Yeah,
Like, it just seemed like, all right, that's the plan. Let's go with it. You know?
Yeah.
No one. And let me
Balked at
tell
it,
you,
right.
you didn't want to be too negative about your prospects because they had zero patience for that.
Well,
people were fired for that.
Yeah, the ODA that was in line before ODA 595, Mark Nooch and the Horse Soldiers, the ODA was fired by
General Mulholland.
Colonel Mulholland then,
Yeah.
because they were just too sort of negative, too many.
Like, this won't work,
Well,
that
what
won't
about
work.
this and what about that? What's the, what's going to happen if this happens? Whereas Mark Nooch's team was not like that. And the other thing that just kind of sticks in my mind from what Justin said was there's a guy called in the book Bob, who was on Team Bravo, who was a three-man team that came in and actually linked up with Team Alpha, and Scott Spellmeyer went over to command them. But Bob was actually the only one of the 11 in total who had no prior military experience. And when they asked him about he'd never parachuted before, and they said, there's a plan here with parachuting, and he's like, fine by me. So he was going to parachute, having never jumped out of a plane before.
That was the first time I heard about the was it the 10 Alpha simulator for the parachute.
Mm-hmm.
The new, at the time it was a new parachute adapted off the smoke jumper rig.
Yep.
And they had a simulator I'd never heard of it, and they said, hey, the simulator's in this tent, and we have it here for training in the event that we decide to do static line infill. And so that was on the table until General Franks agreed to cut the helicopters for that mission.
Have you seen the new free fall simulator?
No, I haven't. No.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. You're actually suspended.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
wearing VR goggles, and then when you actually pull your ripcord, you come down vertical and pull your toggles and move into the drop zone.
Wow.
I saw it at Soft Week a few times.
No, I haven't seen that.
Yeah.
I remember the old generation one that you were like landing on an aircraft carrier. It was a little preposterous, but I mean, the
Yes,
whole point
yes.
was,
Yeah. I remember the instructional video for that. It's a smoke jumper telling you what to do, how it works, and like you see the guy's eyeballs moving as he's reading the cue cards. It just sticks out in my mind for some reason.
Well, Justin mentioned Alex Hernandez, who was the deputy chief of Team Alpha. Alex has just returned from Normandy, from doing static line jumps there. So he's with the round canopy parachute team.
commemorating the Normandy invasion. Right?
Yeah.
36,
So he's still, Alex was, do the math. He was 48, 49 in 2001. He's still jumping out of planes.
That's pretty hardcore.
Yeah.
I imagine that the military guys were really pushing for that jump, to get that mustard stain, and the agency guys are like, yeah, whatever we do, we do.
Well, wait, would you get it? Because
I don't know. That's one of those questions about. I'm sure. Well, really, what happened? I think I would have been. Yeah, they would have just added me to the fifth group. Whatever the memo was that had to be signed. And the orders or whatever. But yeah, no. But that didn't last very long. It was like, why are we going to do that? That's
when
not
you can land
necessary.
birds.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people don't understand that the idea of airborne operations, especially, even on a tarmac, which is
Unmarked drop zone.
which is generally clear, but generally clear unless you go off. But in terrain like Afghanistan, like then what do you do when a guy breaks his leg?
Spread across the mountains in
And when we saw after the fact, the next morning when I saw the site that Dostum had selected for the helicopter infill, I kind of scratched my head a little bit. I mean, I understand why he selected the area, but that actual spot was pretty tough. It was like a gorge.
Someone was telling me, it was later on during the war, that like either a Delta trooper, maybe squadron even, was going to do a free fall jump. and the mission was going to be called like Angry Hornet or something like that, and they ended up calling it Angry Squadron because it got canked so many times. But they ended up realizing like, yeah, the wind is just going to spread us out all over this entire valley.
Yeah.
So yeah, the environmental conditions have to be right.
Can you pass me the booze?
Yeah.
Like Maker's Mark or whatever. So one of the, I think it's one of the stories in the book, and I'm not sure if you were there at the time, Justin, because you mentioned Doston, who was quite a character, but the Air Force, the female pilot.
Yes.
Were you there for that when that was
So
going on?
that was around Kunduz, if I recall.
Well, so there were
Right?
two.
Yeah.
That was the Angel of Death
in Kunduz.
in Kunduz, yeah. This
Okay.
was an F-16, I think, or
Okay,
maybe an
I was-
F-18. That was
I don't remember
that
that.
was
Right,
David
I remember the
Tyson.
story.
That was
Yeah,
like
I
the
remember
psyops where he was getting the Dostum was arranging. I told this anecdote last
To
time I was
taunt it
here.
on the
yeah,
walkie.
it was a psyops.
It's a great story,
taunting
though.
taunting the Taliban.
Yeah.
You know,
This chick's
You won't
bombing
get
you.
into heaven if you're
questioning their
killed by one,
manhood. You know,
Yeah.
the full range of.
Yeah, because these guys were there weren't like encrypted comms, so these guys were basically. Well, he was.
Yeah, like I guess
he
what
was-
we call icons. Or
Yeah,
like
they
a
had-
walkie-talkie.
They put him up. Yeah, he
Yeah.
put the. Well, Dostum had this. God, you probably know. I can't forget the gentleman's name, but he was responsible for managing his comms.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
and he had like a battery powered this, and it was all sort of like expeditionary. And Dostum would stop, and he would put out a carpet and the battery, and he had the scanner like you buy at Radio Shack, and he would just scan the freaks, and then. If they were there for any length of time, Dostum had that, and he would taunt these guys. They would all taunt each other on the radio. And then at one point, and I wasn't there for this, but you related in the book that I think they just keyed both radios to each other and said, hey, I want you to hear what the Angel of Death sounds like, or something to that effect, right?
Yeah.
And
So this female pilot or navigator, I can't remember which. So they had her singing the Navy song, and then Dostum through David sort of translated, but it was not a word for word translation by any means. In fact, Dostum completely made up the translation, and it was all about she's gonna kill you, and she's gonna do this to you and that to you, and so yeah, I mean Dostum's obviously a fascinating character, a guy who's done some terrible things in his life.
Oh yeah.
To put it mildly, and I keep on hearing new things actually. But whatever, I don't know, a fourth grade education, and there's debate about whether he can even really write. But he spent his whole life fighting, and so in the moment, in the I guess the hour of need of the United States, he was the guy, and he had the men, and he had the resources, and he had the will to sort of fight the Taliban, and he certainly understood warfare in the mountains, I think it's fair to say.
yeah.
Just
yeah, he really
what
did.
were you? Because you worked with. What were your impressions of Dostum?
So it's important to note, like when I mentioned I was an intern at the agency and director of intelligence. I happened to be with the South Asia and Central Asian analyst. So I was around stories about him back in the early 90s. So I knew who he was. I was aware of his background. And anyway, so fast forward how many ever years, he was pretty much what I expected. I mean, he was this commanding, dominant sort of figure. He was a little bit taller than the average Afghan, so he's like an imposing guy. Mm-hmm. He wasn't mean. Like the stories particularly from the U.S. side had been pretty bad. Like he had done this, and there's reasons why these stories were promulgated, but his reputation was horrible. But when I met him, he was quite friendly. Now I think he's got a ability to kind of like, he's very smart, very intelligent, that he's going to treat us differently than he's going to treat his lieutenants or whomever. But I never saw him ever have cross words with us. I know Jer on a couple occasions had to sort of lay down the law with him, but I didn't see that. He was always well behaved in terms of his conduct that I saw. I've heard all the stories later, before and after. But most important, he was the right guy at the right time, and he was a good commander, and he was an effective commander, particularly relative to some of the other groups, and so everybody wanted or assumed that the Panjshir was going to be the main effort. That's where the battlefield success would come from. That's where the decisive maneuver would come from. But that's actually not what happened. What happened was Dostum was much more dynamic and aggressive, and he seized the opportunity enabled by ODA 595 and 534 and all these, our team, to take the fight to the Taliban, and he was successful. And it was his success that really was the impetus for the Panjshiris and under Fahim Khan to advance on Kabul.
Because Ahmad Shah Massoud had been assassinated by Al Qaeda on September the 9th.
Yeah.
So he was, the leader, and he was the leader that the agency dealt with in MI6 in Britain. And so there was some sort of disarray, I guess, some jockeying for position amongst the Tajiks. And certainly, General Tommy Franks, lost his temper with him on one occasion. And, there were lots of demands for money to do stuff and for the Americans to sort of kind of carpet bomb a path to Kabul before they did anything. And so, Dostum and the Uzbeks and Team Al from 595 and 534 alongside him kind of stepped into the breach.
Now, there were a lot of warlords, and they weren't necessarily allies except for in their fight against the Taliban. Massoud's assassination was very sophisticated and very timely. Was there ever any evidence that that somebody had helped them with this?
With the assassination?
With the assassination?
So all I know is what I read, and there were two guys who were masquerading, I believe, as Algerian reporters. And the story that was related to me is that one was the bona fide attacker, and the other one was apparently unwitting. And he clacked off something in his camera that would eventually kill Massoud, because they evacuated him to Tajikistan, I believe. Yeah. And then he passed away later. And
I think he may have already been dead.
He may have already.
And they put him in a freezer, kind of. They didn't want to announce that he was dead.
And then the other guy ran for it, and his personal security attachment gunned him down. That's what I heard. But I don't know anything about ISID. I know ISID was in Kunduz with the Taliban when we were there, and that they were able to leave. But I don't know if they were complicit in any sort of plot against Massoud.
And I've always thought, and I've talked to a lot of people about this, that the two operations were independent, like 9/11 and killing Massoud. I mean, it seems like that there would have been sequencing because there's 2 days. Right. Mm-hmm. I actually think it was a huge mistake for Al Qaeda to do 9/11 2 days after they'd killed Massoud, because if it had been 2 months, then they probably would have cleared the Tajiks out of the Panjshir Valley and left the United States with no foothold in Afghanistan at all. So I think, and I also knowing to an extent how Al Qaeda and these groups operate, these two things were independent, and it was just and it just so happened that they both kind of worked at on those particular days. Yeah.
I mean, we had that interesting conversation with Chris Miller about, that whole decision, in southern Afghanistan, like, do we cut the road or not that one night? Mm-hmm. And that was the night everyone flowed down into Pakistan. Mm-hmm. There's some coordination taking place on some level. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about Spann, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So, Justin, when you met him, what were your impressions of him in particular?
So my first impression was I knew he was a Marine, so that I knew his bona fides in terms of his military sort of professionalism, but he was very quiet. So and I sat next to him in the van, if I recall, and then we chatted, and then slowly he kind of opened up. But turns out that was his nickname at the farm was like Quiet Mike or something like that. So he was just a quiet guy, but once you got to know him, he opened up pretty quickly. And but his default setting was quiet, and so. But yeah, he was great. I mean, and we were doing the name dropping thing because he had been an Anglo officer, so Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Officer, and so I knew some guys from school that had gone that route, and I was comparing notes in the van ride to the aircraft, and then chatted with him a bit on the airplane, but I didn't really get to know him until we parted with the rest of the team because the team split. This is detailed in the book. From Dehi, where we initially landed, south to Yakalang to go to Karim Khalili, who was the Hazara leader. It was myself and Mark, who's the medic, and Mike, who's the team lead. That's when I really got. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, just Mark Rausenberger, who
Rausenberger,
died in the Philippines in 2016.
He passed away a couple years ago, and sadly, and he was phenomenal, great medic.
So it was like Silent Mike, and Dark Mark was one of Mark's.
Mark, he just had this, but they were all. They had a great sense of humor. That was the key, and in those kind of situations where there's a lot of, I mean, let's be honest, there's a lot of downtime that's boring, and you're in these like austere conditions, and so you got a laptop and you got each other to sort of pass the time and talk, and they were great. It really was a good time, and we had a lot in common, it turned out.
Can we talk about like the events that led up to his death, like what was going on at that point in time?
So, well, Toby, in terms of all the chronology of it, is put it all together remarkably. So, leading up to it, I had been with Mike from that trip to Bamiyan or to Yakalang. Then we came back, and there was this period where we were sort of getting settled into Mazar Sharif. The Taliban had evacuated the area, and they had moved to Kunduz. We were tasked to go to Poli Kamri, which is a town kind of south of Kunduz, and try to rally the forces there to block a southern escape route. So if the offensive went against Kunduz from west to east, that they couldn't squirt down south towards the Selang Pass and get away, right? So we had some problems convincing the guys sitting in the town, the sub-warlords, the lieutenants of the warlords, to do anything, because at the time, I think in their view, they had no incentive to do that, because it was now all the parochialisms of like the Tajiks versus the Uzbeks and the Hazaras was playing out, and they wanted to basically seize real estate. Mm-hmm. So Mike was really frustrated with that, understandably. We had a night with Alex at this sort of bourgeois villa that had been built in the 70s by the Soviets, and then Mike and I went back towards Mazar. And on the way back, this is the day before he passed away, that we got word that there was a group of foreign fighters, but the way the Afghans are related, it's always that they're Chechens. At the time, it was like they're Chechens. Okay, there's 300 Chechens. So we were very interested in figuring out what the truth was, and so we were moving forward, heading back to Mazar, so we're like heading northwest, and we run into the main body of Dostum's guys, with JR and everybody, and then we conferred with them, and then we found out that these guys, in fact, had surrendered, and that they had been moved to the compound we had stayed at, the Kalai Jungi, the so-called war fort, which is this 19th century mainly 19th century building, giant complex, and so we decided that we were going to interview the prisoners, and we got there the night before, right at dusk, and the Afghans told us to come back. Dave was with us, so we had Dave because we picked him up. Dave spoke the languages, so he had to be there. And then Dave talked to the Afghans, and they were cagey. They said, now's not good. Come back later.
We had a suicide bomb.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There was a guy lying there on the ground with a tarp over him, or like a quilt or something. And I'm like, who's that guy? That's the guy who killed himself, clacked off, where he blew himself up with a frag.
And took out a couple of Dostum's commanders.
Get one of them who was a really good guy, Amanullah, right? And he had been Dostum's like S2, J2, whatever you want to call him, and really a nice guy, big guy, like 6'4", and just a genuine nice guy. He was very pious Muslim, and he treated the Taliban prisoners with dignity, right? He didn't abuse them or anything like that, and I distinctly remember that. And he was killed, and so we left, and then we went back, and then the very next morning, early in the morning, I was watching the radio, so we'd pull shift, and around 7:30 in the morning, and I didn't expect this, Alex called. Alex was the deputy. He was back in Pulikamri or down that way, and he said, look, I don't have wheels. We just got this vehicle delivered from Uzbekistan. It was a WAZ, Russian WAZ truck, Jeep, actually a Jeep, like a 4-speed. Can you please deliver us to us? And so the plan shifted from I'm going with Mike and Dave into this compound to interview the prisoners to I'm going with this gentleman, Greg, who was another GB officer, SEAL, and we're going to go deliver this vehicle. And so that's where I parted ways, and that's the last time I saw Mike alive. And then later that day, and I'm sort of compressing the timeline very quickly, the vehicle broke down, there was this whole side story on that. We come back, I'm completely ignorant of what's going on at the compound. Things started late morning, and word eventually trickled back to where we were staying, which was called the Turkish School. That was in a boarding school built by Turkey with Turkish money, and that we were staying there, and that, hey, there's this thing going on down at the Kalajangi, which was on the south side of Mazar-e Sharif.
So,
but yeah, go ahead.
So basically what had happened, so Justin's going off with the vehicle, David and Mike had gone to the fort to question these Al-Qaeda prisoners. So these are the first Al-Qaeda prisoners that have been questioned by the United States after 9/11, and it was clear from seeing them the day before, that these were all foreign fighters. They weren't Afghans, and David describes it as the smorgasbord of Al Qaeda. Every nationality you could possibly imagine, including American. So although they didn't know that, but John Walker Lind,
right,
was in there, and I think it's interesting. You ask about Mike. And obviously I, never met him. But, he's a 32-year-old former Marine who I sort of envisage him. And I think, in a way, he was quite similar to you, Justin, in terms of kind of mentality and kind of, I feel like the personification of 9/11, was there at the tip of the spear to get to Al-Qaeda, to kill, capture it, stop it happening again. And I think Mike of everybody of everyone on the team was kind of the most kind of, I don't know how you would, hardcore or
serious, kind of, not someone to be trifled with. He was a serious guy, but he wasn't, there was much more to him than that, but that was the main ethos. There was like, we're here to do the job, we have a mission, and we're going to get the job done. And it was very, very much a serious approach to things, and a real focus, like, don't forget what happened, and don't forget why we're here. Mm-hmm. And people forget that nowadays. I don't think people realize at the time, right? Mm-hmm. It was to go in there and, yes, deny Afghanistan as a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, but it was first and foremost to try to find Al-Qaeda and destroy it. Mm-hmm. To remove the Taliban because they were obviously supporting Al-Qaeda. But also, let's be honest, there was a revenge element to this. Mm-hmm. They had murdered nearly 3,000 people right across the river here. Mm-hmm. And folks in the Pentagon and the plane in Pennsylvania as well. And Mike he imbued that sort of ire, that energy.
Mm-hmm. So I always remember, and Shannon Spann de Bruin now, she's since remarried. She spoke, and she did a beautiful article for Memorial Day for AARP Veteran Report about Badger 6. And incidentally, Badger 6 was the call sign when Justin, Mark, and Mike, when you went to Yakalan, wasn't it? That's where the name for the organization.
Yeah, when we split from Team Alpha and created a separate element, and of course Scott Spellmeyer and they had split as well. They had to come up with call signs, and I don't remember the genesis of that term, but we just decided on it, and then it became our call sign, Badger 6.
But the thing that Shannon said in her eulogy at Arlington for Mike was that he was in the right place at the right time, which obviously the sort of cliche formulation for people die there in the wrong place at the right time. But she was very kind of specific about that, and I think that was very sort of true to Mike. And it's just very interesting to me that it was David and Mike. That it was just sort of happenstance in a way that they were the two that went there that day. But you have David. David was 40, Mike was 32. So David a little bit older, but vast experience in Central Asia, all these languages. Mike had his, and David would sort of, knowing all about the culture and the sort of nuances and the different kind of tribes and the different kind of ways of behaving in that part of the world. And Mike wasn't that at all. He was sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, as like very direct and focused, as Justin said. But they had worked together before with prisoners in the Dar es Salaam Valley. Generally speaking, sort of low-level Taliban prisoners. And Mike was very, very precise about his questioning, kind of relentless about writing down the questions. David, I think, a more sort of free-flowing sort of character, and they knew how to sort of play good cop and bad cop. And people often ask about the risk they took that day, and some people will say things like, it was stupid they went in there without protection and all that. Well, they did have protection, but it was the Northern Alliance. But in this, I don't know, across 6 provinces, you had 13 CIA officers, a couple of ODAs, a few people from the ODC.
That's the name of the game at the time.
I mean,
everyone was taking big risks every day.
Every single day. I mean, and I do vividly remember actually when we first spoke, Justin talking about, on that journey to Yakalang, thinking about, if something happens here, we'll just be, a bunch of bleached bones, in the desert, found decades later. And so the incredible amount of risk every day was a sort of a feature of this. And this was not just any other day. It was going into question 400 Al-Qaeda, so they certainly knew it was dangerous. But there was this sort of imperative to find out who these people were. And indeed, many of them, including Lind, had trained at Al-Qaeda camps like Al-Farouk and trained in sort of assassination operations and chemicals and toxins.
Yeah. I read the part of the deposition on Lind, and it was the sort of story of how he got there, and in a way it was sort of indicative of all the other guys. Like all these guys, whatever country they came from, Malaysia, Indonesia, the United States, the Australia, they all were drawn to Afghanistan because they had this interest in jihad, etc. And it was kind of interesting to see how he went to Yemen. He was studying the Quran in Yemen, and then he met some people there who kind of drew him to Afghanistan. But what was interesting was the initial draw was not to fight in Afghanistan. It was to go to Pakistan, and then he was going to be used in Kashmir. And apparently he didn't like that idea, and then he made his way to Afghanistan. He ended up in southern Afghanistan, where he actually met bin Laden. And then what bin Laden did was he gave these foreign fighters as a fighting force to Mullah Muhammad Omar, which became known alternately as the Al-Ansar Brigade, the Helpers, or the 055 Brigade, because I think from bin Laden's perspective, they couldn't be trusted in the inner circle. They weren't Arabs, they weren't part of that inner circle, but they were good fighters, they were zealous, etc. And so they would be great for Mullah Muhammad Omar as shock troops, which is, as I understand it, kind of how he envisioned them and how they were implemented in the fights against the Northern Alliance before we got there.
And I mean, on that day, November 25th, 2001 as well, I mean, it's incredible resources available to sort of journalists and authors. I mean, there was a video taken, well, certainly there's some video that David Tyson took, where you can see the prisoners out in the courtyard. But also, one of Dostum's intelligence guys was taking video of the whole thing, which it just cuts right at the moment of the uprising. But you know, you had all these 400 Al-Qaeda in the basement of the Pink House, which was this sort of Soviet-built school house in the center of the southern compound, sort of split in two, and they're brought out, you know, in 1s, 2s, and 3s. David, who's working with Dostum's intelligence people, so all the sort of many languages are kind of covered. David's focusing on the people who speak the languages. He speaks like Uzbek and Russian and Turkmen and Dari. And Mike, you know, is kind of a sounding board, but he's focused on anybody that might speak English or be Western. And it's eerie watching him, Mike, on that video, like focusing like a laser beam on John Walker Lind, who didn't say a word, and almost without exception, these guys were talking. Now, a lot of it was sort of propaganda, just kind of rubbish. You know, I'm here. I'm working for Mossad. Oh, I'm working for the CIA. I'm a journalist. You know, I'm just a hitchhiker. All this type of stuff. But Lind, completely silent, even though David and Mike, and this is captured on video, are, you know, they're clearly American, and they're giving him a chance, and they're questioning him, you know, really pretty fiercely. And Mike, you know, Mike had honed in on the fact, first of all, you know, he was dirty and had a heavy beard, but, you know, clearly Caucasian, and sort of not Arab or not from you know, Central Asia, but he had this sweater on, and actually to me, interestingly, it kind of looks like a Royal Navy sweater, like it's navy blue with these patches on the elbows and on the shoulders. And Lind had been instructed by Al Qaeda at the Al Farouk camp to tell the other Al Qaeda fighters that he was Irish, not that he was American. And so Mike and David picked up from one, actually I know which prisoner it was, it's an Iraqi prisoner. Weird, I mean, there's some weird people there. This was an Iraqi Shiite that somehow ended up here.
Wow.
Yes, yes. Who ended up at Guantanamo for his sins. But he had told them about the Irishman, you know, talked to the Irishman. And so, and actually there's a chapter in First Casualty called The Irishman. And so, you know, Mike sadly died, you know, in the first few moments of the uprising, you know, thinking that, you know, John Walker Lind was an Irishman because John Walker Lind hadn't said anything. But yeah, I mean, so Lind was out in the courtyard. There was just I think 18 or so prisoners still left in the basement of the Pink House, and you know, you see it on the video where there's a couple of prisoners being led out, and all of a sudden there are shouts, explosions, and that's you know, hand grenades going off. So the prisoners had kind of rushed the guards inside the Pink House at the top of the stairs, overcome them, started killing them. I mean, I think there's that, actually, I remember Justin talking to me about that. There's this moment, you know, when everything kind of goes south, where you can take control of it or not. And if you don't, you've kind of lost any chance of regaining the momentum. And you know, one thing that David and Mike didn't really know was that Dostum's guard force that day was, you know, the sort of B team or the C team. In fact, I spoke to one of them who told me that the day before he'd been an onion farmer, and he'd never fired a weapon in his life. And he's on the video actually, sort of manhandling John Walker Lind, you know, with his AK-47. But you know, he was not a soldier. at all. And so a lot of the Afghans fled, and Mike was much closer to the Pink House. He was near a couple of doctors who I interviewed in 2020. So they saw a lot of what happened in those early moments of the uprising. And basically, Mike sort of wheeled around. He had an AKMS kind of, hanging it on his back, pulled it over to his shoulder, started shooting, taking out some of the Al-Qaeda guys that were rushing towards him. But the guys with they had their hands sort of tied behind their back, but just with turbans, so it's pretty loose. Their feet weren't tied. They started jumping up and kind of jumping on top of him from behind. He pulled out his Glock, took a couple of them out, but disappeared under this sort of melee of Al-Qaeda prisoners / fighters. They were really no longer prisoners at this point. David was much further away, but he hears Mike shout, "Dave, Dave, Dave." And so David's kind of frozen to an extent. He described this, to me, it was incredible, like the psychological kind of transformation that you undergo when something like this happens. Time slows down, loss of hearing, tunnel vision.
Yeah.
But it's almost like your body is deciding what is important and what's not. And so he lost his sense of hearing, but he heard Mike shouting his name. And David, it's just incredible. And I hope at some stage he'll be on here to tell you about it himself. And I know he'd like to. But to me, to run, the Afghans are going the other way. So, there's one guy with a note, one of the intelligence guys is holding up his notebook so that David doesn't shoot him, because David's got his Browning out, and he's like in diary, he's like, flee, and he survived. But David runs towards Mike, and there's this pile of bodies on top of him, and Dave shoots. There's a guy with a Makarov pistol who's shooting at David, on his way to the Pink House, shoots him twice. He crumples, and David gets to where Mike is and shoots the 4 Al-Qaeda fighters on top of him. 1, 2, 3, 4,
Holy
4,
shit.
3, 2, 1. So each of them get 2 bullets. And then David kicks Mike. He sees blood on the ground. Mike's not moving. The presumption, and I was given a copy of the autopsy report, and he was killed by 2 gunshot wounds to the head. One of them a contact wound. So the presumption is that it was his own Glock pistol that he was killed by. And of course, David can't take any of this in.
Right.
But he grabs Mike's AKMS, and then he's in a whole different world with guys, shooting. He's got grenades bouncing off him, guys flinging themselves at him, headbutting him, and he's shooting them at very close quarters, sometimes kind of just over his shoulder. He eventually makes it out of the southern compound and gets to the northern side of the fort. And so all this is happening while, I guess, Justin's sort of making his way back to the Turkish school, and the SBS with Admiral Calland, who actually sadly died recently. He was the I guess, was he a 1-star or 2-star?
He was 1-star.
1-star.
He was SOC's in command.
Yeah, that's right. He was SOC's end.
He passed away. I didn't know that.
Yeah, just a few weeks ago. He was going to inspect a hospital with some SBS guys who were kind of a bit disgruntled about not being in Kunduz and didn't really like being the personal security detail for a Navy SEAL. And they hear the gunfire, and then when they get back to the Turkish school, the 15-man rescue team is being put together. So there was an incredible amount of things happening that day.
I think there were a couple of really important points. That one, that when Dostum forces received the surrenders, they didn't search those guys. So those guys were down there. And I don't know if you guys
With holdout weapons.
Well,
with
they
their
did
weapons.
they didn't search them properly.
Right,
You're
right.
absolutely right. Yeah.
So when they came out, some of them already had their weapons.
Yeah.
They had stuff. And the other thing is that we're talking about, Team Alpha. We're talking about paramilitary guys, and you, a special forces guy. That wasn't David's background.
No.
He, like, you would expect a guy with a spec ops background or an infantry background to really jump into action like that, but that wasn't his background. Like, he really displayed a great deal of valor for somebody sort of out of, I want to say, a little bit out of his element.
I think that's absolutely right. So, yeah, I mean, I think of all of the 8 of you, David, he had 2 stints in the army. He'd been an artilleryman, as I think Scott likes to joke, playing a lot of basketball in Germany, and then he'd been an ROTC commissioned intelligence officer. But, he'd never done any operations.
Right.
I mean, he had paid attention in his weapons training, and certainly the session that Justin gave him. But if you had to pick, one person who you wouldn't want to be involved in that situation out of the team, it probably would have been David by his own kind of admission. But to me, that's one of the things that I find so fascinating about his experience is you don't know. I mean, you can be the guy that's the golden boy, who's done. We know people like this who are the superstar who does everything in training and looks the part and has the sleeve tattoos and
then won't get out of the truck on the operation
exactly
when you're under fire.
And I kind of I mean, it's not really a comparison, but there are journalists who are like that as well. Who are sort of great, in the office and stuff and talk the talk and look the part and everything. But when it actually happens, they just kind of go to pieces. And so, I've thought about this a lot, and it's sort of in a way connected to the next book that I'm working on is how people react in extremis. And David, in some ways, doesn't sort of really like me saying this, or he always kind of, I don't know, he just rolls his eyes or whatever. But to me, I think it's the sort of, and maybe Justin has thoughts on this, but the sort of the core of your character, that when you're in a situation that most of us will never, thankfully, experience, you don't know how you're going to react. Nobody knows, but something clicks in, or it doesn't. And in David's case, I don't know. He's from his mother's still alive in her late 90s, and she's from, a very simple person in the best sense of the word, sort of like a Mennonite sort of background, plain people, and no fuss and no drama. And so David's father was a veteran, U.S. Navy veteran in World War II. Was on a ship that was hit by kamikaze planes. And so he comes from a sort of heartland, solid, patriotic sort of background. And he's a very sort of understated, easy to underestimate kind of demeanor, which works very well in the CIA. But in that moment, he says it's autopilot. You just do what you have to do. It's not bravery. You don't even think about it. But I guess my assessment is it's sort of the core of your character and who you are, that just kind of comes to bear when you're in an extraordinarily extreme situation with, I don't know, 5%, 10% chance of survival. I mean, it's incredible that he lived through that.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
You saw David in the immediate aftermath of this.
Yeah, so he came back. The long story, of course, is really in the book, but he the element that went into the compound to locate him and Mike initially missed him, and he was able to get out of the compound, and he made his way back to the Turkish school, which was our MSS. The battalion was there, everybody was there, and then I ran into him. And he was shaken, I mean, it was clear that and you got to remember, I was, blissfully ignorant of everything that was going on. So when he showed up, I was interrogating him to figure out what happened. And then I quickly realized that he wasn't in the right state of mind. He had just been through this, this horrific experience. And I remember I grabbed his AKMS, and it was encrusted with like dirt because he had scaled this wall to get out of the compound, and it was just, you know, adobe kind of dirt clogs in it. And I set that aside and asked him what happened. And the first thing he said to me was something about the Chechens and that PKM. And he just kept going on about that. And then when he stopped, I asked him, you know, where's Mike? You know, that was, of course, the logical question. And he said what Toby related about the, you know, the broad contours of that story. Hey, he was on the ground and these guys are coming at me, et cetera, et cetera. And then quickly after that, the SBS detachment and the SOTF came back, the battalion, SF battalion, 3rd battalion. And then I didn't really, that sort of interrupted the conversation, and I was talking to them, and they were like, hey, Dave, you made it. They didn't know Dave. They met him. And so Dave, but Dave, I think that night or the next morning, he jammed out a cable where he told the whole story. And that was sort of, I think, cathartic for him. That was the sort of way of getting out of it.
Which is the cable that Tenet took into Bush in the Oval Office.
President,
with Mike Morrell as the briefer.
Was Mike Morrell? Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Okay. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So, yeah, there was. He was definitely had seen the white elephant, as they say, and he.
I think you said he was like a horse that had just completed the Kentucky Derby. You know, he was just.
Well, he had. I mean, he was. I mean, he just come out of this thing, and he was. You know, he scaled this wall, and he had been through this experience, and yeah, he was. You know, it was a rough day. I mean, like the toughest day of his life, obviously. And I just happened to bump into him, not knowing that story, and then you're asking him questions, not realizing what he had just been through.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, and he talks about, you know, it's in the book about how going back into the fort on the 27th, and because they needed him because he knew where Mike had fallen, although Navy SEAL Steph Bass had identified that as well on the 25th. He was in the SBS team. He was on an exchange with the SBS, but they needed him for his languages, and David just didn't want to go back, you know. And he also said at one point he was next to a T-55 tank and he heard this like rhythmic knocking on the tank, and he was like, "What's that?" And then he looked down and it was his rifle. He was shaking so much that his rifle was just knocking against the tank. So I don't know, an incredible thing to have survived, and you know, very, very few people have lived to tell a tale of sort of operating in extremis like that.
Mm-hmm. It's an incredible story, man. And I mean, I think I've heard you guys tell it a couple times now, and it's still like so horrific. You can only imagine what those guys were going through in that.
And there's so many sort of layers to it as well.
Right.
You know, I mean, dozens and dozens of hours of talking to David, and he still is sort of grasping for what really happened.
Right.
And you know, he's been to psychologists and stuff, and I mean, he still has nightmares. But you know, he talks about wanting to, you know, sort of watch God's video of what happened.
Right.
And then he told me that one psychologist said to me, you know, it's like it's been erased from the hard drive. You're never gonna get that back.
And that's the thing is that, you know, you like I said, in combat ops, like when you do an AAR, somebody will say, "Yeah, I shot the guy on the left side of the building." People go, "There was nobody on the left side of the building. You shot the guy on the right side of the building." And it's just like, you know, when human beings are under duress like that, like memory is such a frail thing, and I'm sure that like he, you know, that it's tough to put it all together.
Yeah. And then you start hearing things from other people. So it gets, you know, I mean, obviously the police sort of deal with this all the time.
Yeah.
And as an author, you deal with it as well. You know, kind of memories get contaminated because people start talking. But yeah.
Yeah.
So let's, if we can fast forward a little bit to, you know, the evacuation, if we can call it that, of Kabul, everything that happened a few years back, and then the formation of Badger 6. And you guys, you know, recently had that event at the New York Athletic Club that I got to meet David, and I got to meet Andy and Shannon and all these people. And Mark Nooch was there.
Yeah.
It was awesome.
Bob Pennington.
Yeah. Tell us about what Badger 6 is and what you guys are trying, how that came together, what you guys are trying to accomplish with it.
So Badger 6 is the charity that we founded to help Afghan refugees that are particularly from the families or the principals that have worked with us back in 2001, 2002. And the idea was after the collapse in Kabul in August 21, it just happened that I was actually at Bethesda at this program called NICO. It's a TBI program. And I started getting emails, and then Shannon, I believe, emailed me, hey, I'm hearing from so-and-so. We just got this deluge of emails from Afghans that we had known. Some of them we hadn't heard from or talked to in ages and years. And it was just, and many of you were involved at the time. It was just this sort of like, just a maelstrom of like inundated with emails and concerns, help us. And so we decided that we were going to do it, but it just sort of, it was a natural reaction to help. Do you remember this guy? Do you remember that guy? And we were sort of vetting these requests. And then eventually we decided that, hey, look, we need to provide some order and structure to this. Once we established who the people were that had worked with us, who was in duress and so forth, there was a lot of paperwork done, as you all know, to try to get them some sort of status in the U.S., whether it's an SIV or P1 status. And some of them made it out, a lucky few. Shannon was deliberately and directly involved in the actual evacuation of certain people. And this was all done through the social media means, separate from Pineapple Express, but it was very much in parallel with that effort. And we got some people out, not many, but we got some out. But the rest that are stuck in Afghanistan were the focus of Badger 6. So we realized, okay, these folks are under duress, they're in Afghanistan, some of them are trying to get to Uzbekistan, some are trying to get to Pakistan, even some have gone to Iran. So we need to help them. What do they need? So we established Badger 6 to help them, mainly to buy them time until they could get status. And so what that means is sustenance. How do we sustain somebody? How much does that cost? How many family members do they have? And that was the aim, and that's what we've been doing is sustaining these people, and then in parallel trying to get them the paperwork processed, which is a whole nother parallel effort, so they can either come to the U.S. or come to a third country and get out of Afghanistan and in certain cases other countries. But the focus is sort of tiered. So it's Afghanistan folks, the folks that are really stranded in Uzbekistan or in Pakistan, and then last and least priority are the folks who've already made it to the States. Mm-hmm. But we take care of all of them.
How are the Uzbek government and the Pakistani government like dealing with refugees from Afghanistan?
So that's actually a great question. It's a complicated question. I think I'll try to answer it big to small. So I think initially they realized that I don't think they wanted the refugees, all right? They couldn't stop it, so because particularly in the north, in Uzbekistan, there was sort of a group that quickly crossed. Some of them were pilots that flew into Uzbekistan and landed there. They couldn't stop that, but what they wanted to do is the problem is they didn't want to be seen to actively push refugees out or mm-hmm. prevent refugees, but at the same time, they didn't want to do anything that encouraged it. Mm-hmm. And so that created a problem. So you had this sort of weird situation where they had refuge in Uzbekistan, for example, but there was always this looming threat of like, hey, are they going to be evicted? What's their status? And so forth. In Pakistan, it was, I think, similar, but the initial group of people that we knew went to Uzbekistan. Slowly but surely, other smaller numbers went to Pakistan, and then a few went to Iran, and then in one or two cases we had folks in Turkey. So Afghanistan was the largest group, Uzbekistan was second, and then now we've been able to get, fortunately, some people into Pakistan. I hear different things. It changes kind of month to month, but the latest I've heard, sadly, is that in Pakistan, there's sort of pressure and people aren't being treated particularly well, and there's pressure to sort of get these Afghans moving along. And I think Uzbekistan has the same pressure. I think part of the problem, just candidly, was trying to get a hold of the embassies, because under normal conditions, these refugees are supposed to apply for this status through the mission in that country, which I was trying to get hold of people and wasn't getting a lot of help. There was a lot of confusion. There was multiple simultaneous sort of efforts with paperwork, and you wouldn't hear anything. And you realize that they were just getting overwhelmed with these requests. I mean, the state was not prepared for it. And so it all became really, the outcome was those who were fortunate enough to get to Kabul or get out through Mazar-i-Sharif in a case with some of our folks were the lucky ones. But once we went wheels up at the end of August, that was it. And then those who were left behind had a genuine case of hard luck, and those are the people we're really trying to help.
And is State Department cooperative on that, or do they care?
I think they care. They just were overwhelmed with the sheer volume, honestly. And then honestly, there's just some disorganization. I mean, they weren't prepared for this. That's my criticism is that when the evacuation, when things started to collapse in Afghanistan, there was no real plan to deal with the sheer volume of people that were going to be looking for help and who were under duress. I mean, I just don't think anybody can argue any other way. I mean, that's just a fact. They weren't prepared for it.
Can't we just fly them as undocumented workers? Or undocumented?
Yeah,
That's
no,
called-
no.
that's
I mean,
called human trafficking, by
yeah,
the way.
yeah.
I mean,
That's a problem. You have to have status. And then a lot of people were, like, well, what about the people from Vietnam that we got out, all this kind
Right.
of stuff? As some of them went to Guam in certain cases. The bottom line is this: you have to have legal status in some fashion to get out of Afghanistan.
Right.
In order to get out and get to a third country, you have to have a passport.
Right.
There's all these prereqs that you have to have, and with the exception of that initial sort of exodus from Kabul and Afghanistan, after that, there were some people who got out, but after that it became, hey, you got to have a passport, etc. So we've spent an inordinate amount of time helping people with that paperwork.
I saw that it was a Secretary Blinken recently signing a updated memorandum of understanding about this issue. But I mean, have they sped up the processing of the visas? I mean,
no one's ever going to be satisfied with
Right,
the speed.
sure.
They have a dedicated effort, but I think that it, just like with all visa processes, that you always, it's first come, first serve. So you get in the stack, and then they're just working down the list of folks and based on who applied and when, and it just takes a long time, and it's heart-rending. I mean, it's really traumatic for these folks, because some of them are in the States and some aren't.
Right.
He was my interpreter in 2012. He got out of Afghanistan, where he got an SIV that I helped him with, and he was a successful businessman, but the rest of his family was stuck in Afghanistan. His brother worked at the U.S. mission in Kabul, and then we're trying to get him out. And so there's so many stories. Each one is complex in its own way, but the bottom line is there's so many of them, and the paperwork process is such that it's just taking forever. And I know, myself included, it's just hugely frustrating. And Shannon and I and everybody in Badger 6 are doing everything we can to facilitate the process. But we realized quickly that while this paperwork process was, unfolding, we had to sustain these people. And we learned that really most Afghan families are kind of large, right? We're talking 6 to 10 kids is not unusual. So you have these large families, and they're trying to survive. And so we figured out basically that I want to say $500 to $600 a month you could sustain one of these families. And so what we do is we raise money through various events. We did the Badger 6 event at the New York Athletic Club where George Tenet was a keynote speaker and I moderated. The money we received in that fundraising effort is used to support families directly under duress in Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, or Pakistan until we can get them out. It's a relatively, in my view, it's relatively cheap to support them. Considering you're talking 5 to 10 people in a family and you're supporting with $500 to $600 a month, but it's a continuous process and there's no end in sight. So we have to do this for perpetuity, at least, not perpetuity, but I'd say another year or two. We have to be prepared to do that. And the way we do that, Dave and other folks in Badger 6 handle, and that has its own sort of process that's kind of complicated, is you're hawalaing money or you're sending money and you have to find a individual that's trusted and who can serve as the interlocutor for the money. And then there's, of course, a transaction fee associated with that. So all that adds together. But we do it without any real overhead. No one gets paid. All the money, all the proceeds from fundraising go to support Afghans or go to, say, transportation costs to get someone to a fundraiser. That is about it. There's no fat, there's no overhead. It's a very lean and very efficient organization.
I mean, to me, it's been fascinating and kind of very moving to watch this happening, because I mean, the members of Team Alpha, Green Berets, Shannon, everybody associated with this were, absolutely devastated and sort of almost kind of bereft and angry and frustrated about what happened in August 2021. But instead of, going on cable TV and complaining about it and stuff, I mean, I sort of watched this grow up where it's like the team getting back together for another mission. And I see it with David, using his languages, and we have Dr. Azim, who lives in New Jersey, who's an Afghan emigre from the 1990s, and he's the main kind of link person along with David with the families. And I mean, this stuff I kind of hear about and know about, the angles that have been worked with different organizations and agencies in this country. I mean, there's back channels, there's personal relationships, and it's just, it's not unlike the spirit of after 9/11, of just, let's just get it done.
Right.
Whatever it takes, we'll improvise. It's sort of kind of on the fly. It's kind of very, kind of modest resources, but they're just doing it. And I mean, the other thing that I think is interesting about Badger 6, and which is why I think it's something really people should support, is that as Justin said, it's finite. It's like 30 or 35 families, and these are people. Badger 6 is about these allies and their families from 2001, specifically about those. And it's not something that's just going to go on for decades and decades, and it's just sort of never ending. Like, hopefully it'll be wrapped up in a couple of years. And there are, I mean, today, we heard that 9 passports had been issued. So there's slow, there's kind of, there's, there were setbacks,
but it's building
and delays, but there's also steps forward and sort of breakthroughs, almost every week. And I mean, Jack, you were there, and I was there at the fundraiser with George Tenet, incredible American, talking about Badger 6. And I mean, for me, the highlight of that night, and it kind of connects to what we were talking, it connects directly to Mike Spann, is Commander Fakir. So Mohammed Fakir al-Jawzjani is his full name. And I met him in 2020 on a sort of dusty airstrip in Sheberghan in northern Afghanistan. That's the last time I saw him. The next time I saw him was probably about a year ago now, where my doorbell rings, and it's David Tyson saying, "Hey, I've got somebody to meet you." And so he got out, and his family got out. Now Fakir, I mean, Justin obviously remembers him, but he was Dostum's kind of, I mean, he was a relatively young guy. He's now in his late 50s. He'd been a warrior for 20 years, but he was Dostum's cavalry commander.
Holy shit.
Yeah. And so he was the guy in the mountains. And he was the guy who located Mike Spann's body. So 3 days after he was killed, he was the guy who led his men into the southern compound. And it's just a sort of a scene of almost medieval carnage there with bodies everywhere. AC-130s had been in. I mean, the place had just been pounded. And Fakir came up to David and said, was Mike wearing cowboys? Cowboys being the Afghan sort of term for blue jeans.
Yeah.
And of course, none of the Al-Qaeda guys had been in blue jeans. And so that was Mike's body. He located Mike's body. And he was also, Fakir the 15-man rescue team on November 25th, it kind of split when they got to the fort. And so I think there were 5. There was Tony from the SBS. There was Steph Bass, the SEAL, Mark Mitchell, Glenn Riccio, who was the CIA medic from Team Bravo, and Fakir, who crept around the outside of the fort, like counterclockwise, across basically a minefield, clambered up the side of the fort using unraveled turbans, like kind of Rapunzel type sort of style, and that was Fakir.
It's unreal.
And so this guy is, one of the good news stories out of this and his family. This guy's now living in New Jersey. Now, I mean, he doesn't speak a word of English, so he's like one of the classic, American immigration story, really, that it's for the next generation. But I think he's got 9 kids or something. But he's now here. And so he's sort of an example of, I mean, and he'd spent 20 years fighting and also holding senior positions in northern Afghanistan. Police, I think he was a police chief of Kunduz province at one point. And so these are the people who Badger 6 are helping. And they were the allies. They're not just some random Afghan that they've heard about. These were the guys they were fighting alongside in 2001. So it's a kind of an incredible thing to see.
It's not it's a very select group of people. The folks that work with us, and then of course their families, dating back to 2001 and early 2002, but mainly 2001. Fakir's a great example. Another individual that got out, was fortunate to get out through the lily pad system, was Soltani, Mullah Soltani, who had actually infilled Mike, Mark, and I into Bamiyan. So he was the guy dispatched by Mr. He has been dispatched to pick us up and take us to Karim Khalili in Bamiyan, in the Bamiyan area. He had done everything right, everything we expected of him. He was a loyal ally and a partner, and he was with us the whole time. And then he rose within the Afghan government system all the way up to, I think at one point he was a parliamentarian, and then he came back and he was a district governor in Samangan when the collapse occurred. And so he had to flee for his life, and his family was able to get out as well, fortunately. They were very lucky. They burned his house. He lost his passport. Everything was destroyed in the house. He got out, and then he ended up in Doha, I think, for a while. Then they went to Germany in Ramstein. Then they went to New Mexico. And then at that point, I mean, they didn't even know where New Mexico was. I remember he texted me or WhatsApped me, his son, actually. Here's the other thing. So these guys are, senior Afghans.
Right.
In some cases, generals. In some cases, senior government officials. They were invested in the Afghan government in GWOT, and then all of a sudden everything just, the rugs pulled out from under them. They don't really speak English well. Fortunately, in Sultani's case, his son speaks English very well. So I communicate through his son a lot, particularly when it comes to complex stuff like paperwork and stuff like that. But I remember he WhatsApped me and he goes, "We're in New Mexico. I'm not really sure where that is, but we're in New Mexico." And I said, "Okay, you're okay. Don't worry. You're going to be there for a couple weeks, and they're going to find a place for you to stay." And I thought they would settle him in the big Afghan hubs. You know, there's Fremont, California, I think. There's D.C., one of these areas. And then we get this. I get this WhatsApp that says, "We're going to Boise, Idaho." And sure enough, they resettled in Boise, Idaho. But what's amazing is Shannon had, through her contacts, was able to locate this very generous businessman in Boise who was able to help Sultani and his family right off the bat until they get set up, and they work through a Christian relief fund in Boise to help them with their paperwork, while we were also putting them in for SIVs and so forth. So this was like a number of people working in parallel in this effort. And so now they're settled in Boise. They're employed. Their SIV paperwork has made it to chief of mission approval level, which is one of the big steps in the process. And so we're hopeful that paperwork will be finalized, and then they will be able to have that permanent status, green card status. But they're the lucky ones. The ones that we're really focused on are the ones that are still stuck in Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Pakistan. And they're the ones that Dave and Miss Dr. Azim send money to and are able to communicate with and vet and so forth.
And some families in Afghanistan itself. You know.
Yeah.
Justin, earlier you mentioned like Vietnam, and it was really like special forces soldiers that really spearheaded and advocated for, you know, Vietnamese Montagnards, you know, and whatnot, to get here to the States. And now, after Afghanistan, it's also special forces soldiers and a lot of CIA personnel. You know, we have Badger 6 with you guys. We have Digital Dunkirk with Mick Mulroy and Mike Jason. We have
Scott Mann,
yep,
with Pineapple Express.
Pineapple Express.
And you know what is it about the special forces soldier, paramilitary officer? Like, what is about them that makes this happen? And if they weren't the spearhead of this, how would our government and in general, our State Department in general, like, would they try to forget these wars?
I mean, you just look at the history. I mean, the going back to Vietnam, right? So you had the Montagnards and the Hmong and so forth that special forces had worked with. We're trained, you know, from the very beginning in SF to work with indigenous forces. That's the whole purpose. We're teachers, right? Green Berets are first and foremost teachers, right? Instructors. Everything is, particularly in Rob and Sage, you know, you're evaluated on how well or poorly you interact with the, in this case, simulated indigenous forces. So to us, it's sort of like the core of what we do. So when you go over there, it's only natural that you build these bonds in a way that I think other Americans don't try to, or they just, it's not that they don't build bonds, but we go in there and that is really our prime directive. That's what we're focused on doing. So it's only natural that we have those relationships. And then that just seems to not go away, right? Like once we, decide, hey, these are our partners, this is our mission, we're here to help them, and they're our partners, then they become our fellow soldiers, right? And so you have that bond with them that I don't think in the regular Army they have the same bond with their partners because they're training them and all that. With us, it's a whole nother level. So when we saw the collapse in Afghanistan or '75, April '75 in Vietnam, I just think it's natural that we feel that we are obliged to help them, right? It's not like, hey, well, that's too bad, and it was a transactional relationship. It's not a transactional relationship. They're our partners, they're our allies, and we're not gonna leave them behind. And it's emotional, it's visceral and emotional, but it's also good policy, right? It's a good policy for the United States to message that we won't leave you behind. I know the CIA believes that, through and through, that if you come to this relation with somebody, that the understanding, the contract is that you stick with them through thick and thin. And so that's the ethos that we have, and that's what animated everybody. I know it did, whether Scott Mann or Shannon or Mick Mulroy or whomever, myself, it's the same.
And it's a skill set as well. And you think like the approach to life of getting stuff done, and you're not waiting for the op order and the paperwork.
Yeah, I know it's absolutely get the job done, whatever it takes, and don't wait for the 100% solution when a 65 or 80% solution is good enough. I think that's really where everybody, because he realized it didn't take long to go, okay, people are really going to get screwed in this situation. There's some people getting out, but the vast majority, and possibly the most deserving people, are not going to get out. And that's wrong, and we should help them. Who's going to help them? And then you look around, it's like, no one's helping them. All right, this is my calling, I need to help.
Where can the public go if they want to donate to Badger 6?
Yeah, so badger6.org is our website, and you go to the webpage, and in the top right, there's a white icon to click on donate. That's the fastest way you can donate, and we look forward to it.
Is it Badger 6 the number, or Badger 6 the...
Badger 6, BADGER 6, one word, .org.
Badger6.org.
And I think /donate will take you.
Yep.
Even,
and look, if you guys are watching this or listening, please just go in and donate at least $1. Just $1, right? $1 out of your pocket. That's nothing for you. If you can afford more, please give more. All right, these are people who literally fought beside us, fought with us, fought for us sometimes.
And we've talked about Mike Spann, and Shannon wrote about this very eloquently. But it's also a way of honoring Mike Spann and people like Mike. And Shannon's, I think Shannon lost her husband. The first casualty on the battlefield for the United States after 9/11, the first of many. So she spent 20 years living with that, and living with the anniversaries, November 25th, the anniversary of the funeral in December, the anniversary of Memorial Day, where in 2001 she and Mike and Mike's daughters and Shannon was heavily pregnant, went to Arlington on Memorial Day 2001. So she thinks, so she then had to deal with, as did so many families and veterans, with the sort of what she describes as the moral injury of August 2021. And so I remember when I interviewed her in 2020, one of the things she said that she clung to about, Mike's death and Mike's life having meaning was that, a generation of Afghan girls had been to school and women had worked, and, Shannon, more than most people, knows that was not, what the mission was for.
That wasn't our goal, right?
Right. But even so,
right.
she'd been to Afghanistan as early as 2002, and had women especially come up to her and thank her and holding pictures of Mike, and so tremendously difficult to deal with August 2021. When that sort of thing that you've clung to for all those years has just been ripped away,
right? And
you were like, it's even same. Mullah Fazl, the guy who butchered the Hazaras as a Taliban commander in the late 1990s and 2000, 2001, back in government,
right?
And clearly the United States is not going to do anything for Afghanistan for the foreseeable future. So so it's even worse. And so, again, to watch Shannon throw herself into this
Yes.
and relive many terrible things in her life, I'm sure. I mean, I was there when she went to the Horse Soldiers Monument a few weeks ago, and she was weeping.
Yeah.
But she's also thanking. I remember she turned to Andy and David, and she said, "As an ordinary American, I want to thank you for what you did after 9/11."
Right.
And this is somebody who lost her husband, and so she is honoring Mike and living her life the way he would have wanted her to, and also continuing living life the way he would have lived life by doing this. And so it's it all comes full circle. It's all connected. And so, you've got Afghan allies and not leaving them behind. You've got Americans who've died there. You've got, as Justin says, you've got doing the right thing just morally, but also in terms of policy. Like how do you recruit somebody and say, we want you to work alongside us at great risk to yourself if they see people being abandoned. So it's all kind of knitted together. And I think something like Badger 6, allows ordinary Americans who may not have been personally connected to any of this kind of be connected to it, because they have feelings about it as well too.
Can you talk a little bit, to the best of your knowledge, because we've talked about it once or twice on the show before, but it's not really a term that has gained popular sort of acceptance or even knowledge, but about moral injury.
Justin might be better than me. I mean, I'm not a big expert on it. I know that people talk about I think it's a magnificent thing to serve your country. I mean, I served my country in uniform. This is now my country. I'm an American citizen, and I would like my son who's 14 to serve this country. But I mean, better than I that sometimes you have to do. Actually, Mike Spann said this. You have to do the things that other people won't do, and there's a cost to that. And I think also, Justin should speak to this really. You see some terrible things. You experience some you might be wounded. You might have PTSD issues later in life. But you do it for, John McCain used to talk about this, a cause bigger than yourself. And so, at the end of World War II, and the Nazis are defeated, Japan's defeated, there's a signing ceremony, and, you're on the side of good, and it's kind of cut and dried. It's not generally like that these days. And so you have to... I remember speaking to the families of Marines that had been killed in Ramadi in 2004. I remember one particular father whose son was killed when I was in Ramadi in 2004, calling him up in Florida when ISIS was driving around, Ramadi in American Humvees that they'd just been captured, and about how hard it is, where you've to some degree you've come to terms with the loss of your son, because Iraq is a better place, and then ISIS is in there, so I think it's difficult to deal with, and I think as a service member, you have to try. There's all these things about you fight for the person next to you. And I think you have to, in some ways, you have to try to disengage from the political piece, and because if you don't, I think it's tremendously difficult, and I think that's where the moral injury part comes in. But Justin, you probably have thoughts on this.
Well, part of it, like you said, you fight for this is the old. You hear this a lot from the World War II vets, Vietnam. We fought for the guys next to us. Well, in our case, many cases, the guys next to us were our Afghan allies, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were 50% or more of the whole effort, and we were enabling them. And so, you know, when I was at Bethesda and the NICO program, when everything happened in August 21, I mean, it was like someone cut my heart out. You know, it was really tough. And part of it is you felt you did something noble, right? Mm. You did something noble, and in our case, we feel like we got it right, at least initially. And then years later, and I went back to Afghanistan several times, and of course Iraq as well, and back and forth. You know, you want to take stock of what you accomplished, and the only way now for me to feel that accomplishment is to help our allies that fought with us, and we fought with them. That's how I sort of patch that up and sort of you know, deal with the wounds associated with everything we put in, and then seeing that the outcome is what it is. It's hard to deal with, and one way you deal with it is by helping these Afghans who are deserving. Yeah, and you know, a lot of people say, well, what's the, you know, how do you define success? I had this discussion about, well, as long as Afghanistan is not a safe haven for terrorists and they don't use it to project, you know, attacks, then that's sufficient, and so forth. But I take a different view. I think there's more to than that. I mean, here we are. We're the United States. We're the city on the hill, and I felt like we owe it to our allies to do everything we can to not only give them a chance for a viable future, but also to, you know, imbue our values in them and share our values with them. And I think the folks that we're helping in badger6.org are the guys who did that and carried that, our values, and wanted to imbue them into their society and wanted to do the right thing and do everything we asked of them. And that's why I feel so much allegiance toward them.
Do we have questions for Justin and Toby?
No.
Okay.
No. I wanted to ask you, Justin, because, you know, you talk about this, and, you know, we have some, and not a lot, but some voices on the left where it's like you were waging war against brown people, and you have some voices on the right, not a lot, but when we're trying to get Afghan in, it's like you're letting, like, these brown people into the country, right? Like, yeah. How do you address those sort of extremes in that view that, no, we're not over there just randomly killing brown people, and no, we're not just randomly letting, like, terrorists into the country? Like, how do you address that from your experience?
Well, I mean, I can speak from my experiences that we were there actually working with the locals. So when we went in, I mean, you know, Afghan's a complicated place. There's a lot of ethno-sectarian tensions. Our allies were one group that made sense to fight the Taliban and so forth. And so naturally, you know, the enemy's going to be destroyed, and we were successful, and that was part of it. It was war, it was combat, but we weren't out there arbitrarily just going after people of a different, race and culture. That was not the case at all. We were actually working with people of different race and culture to combat their enemies, who happen to be our enemies, you know, and so but to your point about that, I didn't get a lot of that. I think what I got later on in, like, the mid-2000s, you know, 11 and 12, or 8, 9, when I was at graduate school, was, you know, what do you hope to accomplish there? You know, that was kind of thing. What are you trying to accomplish there? Is democracy going to take root? Is that really realistic, et cetera? That was the sort of tack they took. But on the other end, now, what you're dealing with, the folks that are suspicious of immigrants, and there's a whole side of the spectrum that's very unreceptive to immigration. My answer, at least from Badger 6's perspective is we're helping a discrete group of people that we know that are thoroughly vetted, that, you know, either Dave, myself, Dr. Azim knows, and that they are not just some random group of people that are coming in and being passed through. They're not jumping on an airplane in Kabul and flying out. These are people we know, that we vetted, and they're immediate family members that we're helping. And so I don't see any risk there. I do understand the concern that if you had, you know, just random folks surging in, getting on a plane and coming in, that those people, rightly so, need to be vetted. And honestly, many of them were. And you know, the Air Force and all that ran a lot of these had encampments, I think they did a very thorough and good job of trying to identify those folks. I mean, that there was a bunch of people that made it out that were not vetted, and we didn't know who they were. And there was a deliberate effort to screen those folks. Our situation, our case is very different. Mm-hmm. We're talking about a much smaller group of people that we know within 1 point of separation or 1 degree of separation, who they are and what their bona fides is. I get requests all the time, and it's heartrending, particularly on LinkedIn, from people that say, I did this with the U.S. government, or my father did this with the U.S. government, and you should help me. And I have to tell them, I said, our focus, our whole diopter is set in a certain way, and I'm sorry, but we're not going to help you because we don't know you and you didn't work with us. Mm-hmm. And it's really that simple. And you have to be that way. We're very small, and we have to set the parameters as they're set in order to make it manageable and then help. We don't want to have this diffuse effort that helps everybody and nobody. Mm-hmm. It has to be focused.
So if you're watching or listening, please donate a minimum of $1, maybe a little bit more, to Badger 6. And the link's in the description. And please retweet or tweet or Instagram or Facebook or whatever you do. I don't know. TikTok, WhatsApp, I don't know. But like, throw it out there. Throw Badger 6 out there for the people who, you know, don't watch our show. Hook a brother up. Square these people away, please.
Anything else you guys want to talk about? Anything that you want to direct people's attention to? What's the next Badger 6 event that's coming up?
So right now it's sort of being formed, but we're looking at doing an event, a sort of sporting clays shooting event in southern New York in September, roughly in that time frame. We will advertise that in the near future. I'm putting that together as we speak, and we're a small team, so it takes a lot of effort. I'm actually putting the flyer together, but we will advertise that, and that'll be sometime in the first, second, or third week of September, and we hope to see people out there and to shoot. We're going to have Mark Nooch. We're going to have the team leader of the Horse Soldiers. We're going to have myself. We're going to have Dave Tyson that we spoke about at length. We're going to have Alan Mack, retired Chief Warrant Officer and 160th pilot, a legendary aviator in the special operations community. We hope to bring those guys up. We're going to have a great half day of shooting, and then we're going to have a fireside chat where we tell stories. So, but we'll follow up on that. But thank you for your interest.
I think you're likely to do a DC area event at some point.
Eventually, yeah, absolutely.
TBD,
yeah. That'll be a bigger one. I don't know the timeline yet, though. Are we talking later in the fall? I think.
I haven't seen, but sometime, yeah, probably late fall, I would think.
There'll be iterative events, but I'd say the DC event will follow the one in Southern New York, and we'll continue to have events probably once a quarter, once every 6 months.
And yeah, we've had Alan Mack on the show, and I'd love to have Mark on the show. I promised Mark I would read his book, so I got to get that done for him before.
David Tyson too.
Well, yeah, that's the plan down the line too.
Yeah. I know David wants to come on.
Let's also do a quick shout out for Sound Off, just because if you're a veteran or an intelligence professional and you're going through tough times, like Sound Off will help you maintain anonymity and.
Yeah, it's an app that people can download, and so there's a lot of guys who are afraid that they're gonna like lose their security clearance or something like that if they go see a unit psychologist or something like that. So a former CIA officer actually kind of spearheaded that thing, and so you can download this app and you can talk to a shrink anonymously. So that's out there, guys. If you don't need it, tell people in your unit, wherever you work, that it's out there, so that guys who work in a covert or clandestine world know it's out there and that it's a resource.
Who's the CIA officer?
William Negley.
Okay, don't know.
Yeah, we'll have to have William on the show sometime.
Yeah, for sure.
I met him down in Tampa.
And we look forward to your future book.
Yeah, so I'm working. There's always, the gap between my previous books was about a decade, and if I keep that up, I'm just going to run out of time.
Look, it's a good living if you can.
Well, it's never been a living, unfortunately. But so I'm working on a project that's connected to CIA and valor, and the recognition of valor, and it's very different from. It's going to be published by Simon & Schuster, probably the middle of 2025, maybe around Memorial Day 2025, which seems a long way off, but it means I've got to kind of deliver in less than a year. But yeah, different from First Casualty, because that was very focused on, really at its core, 8 people over the course of 3 months. This spans the entire history of the CIA, 75 years, and also the OSS. So I've just come back from Slovenia and Trieste, where I was, kind of following the footsteps of an OSS officer who later joined the CIA in Slovenia in 1944, 1945. Incredible, and he then spent his later years in Trieste. Tomorrow I'm going to see in New York, I believe he's 98 years old, a guy who I've been trying to get in contact with for a long time, and he called me. I'd sent him a note saying I was going to be in New York, and he called me and he's like, "This is Eric." And I was like, "Great." And he was a POW in World War II, not too many of those alive. And so incredible kind of stories. And, we discussed David Tyson. I'm very, very interested in, sort of courage in the shadows, if you like, where you're doing a job where you never expect recognition. And in fact, it usually only comes if things go badly wrong. And also the connections between the OSS and the CIA were ever present in 2001. The Jedburgh teams, and particular person I'm focusing on, who was in Slovenia, a stateless Yugoslav, who's working with German Jews who had got out of Nazi Germany, made it to the United States, and were then on OSS teams, Austrian deserters, people who'd been Italian prisoner of wars who were Slovenes, who then worked for the OSS. You got the British SOE. It's kind of incredible stuff. And, Team Alpha was the spirit of the OSS, this improvising, working with indigenous allies behind enemy lines in small teams. So it's a huge subject, and the challenge is how to knit it together. But it's it's very rewarding, and I'm speaking to people that it's just a privilege to be able to talk to them.
Yeah. Justin, he's talking about the OSS, and he's talking about the heritage of the Jedburgh teams. Looking in retrospect now, you were part of a handful of people.
Yeah.
On the leading edge of history, right? A 20-year war that was spearheaded by you and the men around you, and then the other teams. Is that anything you ever imagined prior to that date? And looking back on it, do you have any particular feelings about how it, about being part of history that way?
Well, I was interested in Afghanistan. I was obviously, as an SF guy, interested in the history of SF and the genesis out of OSS and all that. But I never, came up in the Army in the mid to late 90s when it was sort of Bosnia and all that kind of stuff, and it was inconceivable to me that we'd ever go to Afghanistan. I did think Iraq would be an issue, and I was following these ideas they had of overthrowing Saddam through kind of like a soft, unconventional warfare operation. But I was interested in Afghanistan sort of from a historical point of view, particularly with the CIA campaign in the 80s to defeat the Soviets. I was pretty knowledgeable about that, and I distinctly remember, I think it was in the beginning of Robin Sage, before we went out in the field, they had this classroom instruction period, and they were showing some videos from Afghanistan in the late 80s, and the documentary. And I remember thinking, wow, that's kind of interesting. That's appropriate. I forget the name of the instructor who did that, but it was pretty prescient, right? And I was commenting on the documentary because I knew a lot about it. My dad had been in the Afghan task force in the early 90s, right, in CIA. And I remember one of the NCOs or one of my peers was like, well, why do you care about that? Or, why do you know so much about Afghanistan? And I said, I don't know, I just find it interesting. And then, of course, 2001, little did I know that I would get to visit Afghanistan. But I had no sense of the historical significance until I went in, and I think when Colonel Mulholland at the time said, hey, I got to pick 3 of you guys to go, that felt like, I just felt this sort of like pressure, like the atmospheric pressure just increased, and it was just coming down on you, because you realize, okay, you better not fumble the football here. You've, by luck and pluck and timing, you've, positioned yourself here. So now you need to get the job done, and sort of like, I think we use the metaphor like you're surfing some super tsunami that's like U.S. just anger, right? And you're surfing this wave, and you don't want to wipe out. And I remember I turned to one of the guys, Jim, that I was with, and I said, well, hey, I'm honored to be part of this, and we all realized it was important, but we had no idea what was going to occur. We just knew that we had sort of won the unconventional warfare lottery, in the sense that we were at least initially able to get involved early on. But then years later, after going back to Afghanistan multiple times, I could see the arc of it. Mm-hmm. And there I was, 12, when there was like 100,000 Americans in Afghanistan, and going, wow, I remember when there were 8 of us on the ground, or maybe 200 people in the whole country, and now we're like 100,000. Mm-hmm. And things aren't, 12, things were not going that well. So yeah, and but I never thought that we would just leave. I always thought, hey, there are certain parts of Afghanistan that are never going to be pacified, or never going to be great. And those are traditional areas. When the Soviets were a problem, when we were there, a problem. But I just, I thought, well, you know what, we're going to deal with those areas, but we have our allies and we'll support them. And so, yeah. But looking back, yeah, I wasn't, I didn't get into the sort of melodrama of it. You just went on, because as soon as Afghanistan was over in 01, there was Iraq in 03. I mean, there was probably an interval of maybe 8 months between the time 5th Group got back, 5th Special Forces got returned from Afghanistan. 6 months later, I was HAC Commander, 5th Group. I heard about the dep order for Iraq probably in August or September or something, and then it was all about Iraq. Mm-hmm. And so you just didn't have time to really reflect on things. It was like, that was yesterday's news, and now you're going to do the next thing. And that went on for a while, because it was a tempo. You were there. It was just a tempo.
It's a long time before you're able to process all of that.
Yeah. Do you think that we ever should have, not just America, but the United Nations, do you ever, given the way countries were sort of drawn up, do you think that it ever would have been beneficial to, in the modern era, relook those areas and go, well, look, the Pashtuns don't want to be part of Afghanistan. They're not part of. They don't recognize Afghanistan or Pakistan. That it ever would have been beneficial to look at those sort of political realities.
You mean partitioning in an ethno-sectarian kind of way? Yeah, I thought about that a lot. I thought about the, Pashtunistan is the way it has been referred to, is that this sort of swath of territory from the tribal areas in Pakistan all the way into southern Afghanistan is one sort of kind of potential political kind of entity. The problem you always ran into is Kabul. Okay, so who gets Kabul, and how are you gonna? That's the political seat. There is a sense, the Afghans have a sense of being Afghan, but then the ethnic, sensibilities get in the way of that. I was always like, well, we got to keep it together at the time. Now I look back and go, well, there's another way of looking at it. You could have partitioned Afghanistan and made it into these kind of ethnic based countries. But then you run into the issue of, are they viable economically
And
all this kind of
intermarriage
stuff.
and mixed families.
And then all the mixed families,
Right.
particularly in the Kabul area. The problem, in my view, was that we ran against the grain of the decentralized nature of Afghanistan, right? That was a problem, that we had this centralized approach, and that you were forcing people to choose down at the grassroots level between one patronage system and the other.
Right.
And so when they had to choose, like, you're going to go with the government, and this, because the government would pick its cronies, and then the Taliban had their people, and you're forcing people to make a binary choice, which was kind of, I think, what undermined things in the long run. And I worked development governance for a while under General Miller when he was the CIFSOC commander in Afghanistan, and we did everything we could to try to build that relationship between the central government in Kabul and down to the province and the district. But you were always running into these issues of like the fragment, where things rifted between the different, the Ghilzais versus the Duranis, and that you were in fact ultimately forcing the locals to choose between one group or the other.
Countries choose their strategic allies, and the locals have to choose their tactical allies
Right.
just to survive.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, even in America, like, we see how divided we can get with the Union, and there it's even our states, and whatnot. But there it's the tribal lines are 10 times more defined and competitive.
And you really need to study it because it's so nuanced that I never felt like I totally understood it in sufficient detail to really manage things. I mean, I probably understood it better than the average bear, but it was so. I remember there was a map that they produced. I don't know, it was a CIA map or something, but it had all these little looked like little plus marks, little crosshairs where each different tribal subgroup was, and it was all the entire country of Afghanistan, and it was just so complex. The Achakzai and the and all these different groups, and keeping track of them. And then you would go into certain areas and realize that area had been a Hazara area, but they had been ethnically cleansed over the years, and so the names were Hazara sounding names, but they were in fact Pashtun villages. And so I don't think your average American soldier really understood that, right? And but there's a natural way of things there. There's the natural societal norms there. And then we did figure it out because the guys that were the so-called power brokers that we supported were the natural leaders in those areas. So it was like, Mateola Khan up in Orzgan when I was there, and then he was killed. And then you had Razik, who was the provincial chief of police down in Kandahar, who is a very strong leader that we supported. And so we figured that out, but we had to choose. Like, okay, we're going with this guy. This is our guy. And but as soon as you choose that side, you've automatically alienated all these other people. And how we managed that, I think, was problematic. I think part of it was the centralized, very trying to force this very centralized approach. Everything has to emanate from Kabul. And then we helped them write a constitution. I'd like to meet the lawyers. I heard we shipped in some lawyers to help write the constitution back in '02. I've never met any of those folks.
Probably lying low right now.
Yeah, I'd like to talk to them.
Yeah.
To see what the mentality was,
Yeah.
but it definitely went against the grain.
Copy paste.
Yeah, I mean, I remember being in Helmand in 2009, and this term, which actually I heard you use earlier, Justin, like GWOT,
Yes.
Government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and GWOT, and I was like, what's GWOT? And then the soldiers, Welsh guards I was with, told me, and the idea of getting Pashtuns in Helmand to sort of feel any kind of allegiance or even connection with GWOT in Kabul, kind of crazy.
Yeah.
But that was what everyone was pushing at the time.
Well, guys, I hope you'll pick up First Casualty.
That's the paperback version
Yeah, the
with an
paperback
epilogue.
and the hardback. AARP.org, that report, and
Slash
Badger 6.
And I also need to give a quick shout out to Civ Group, CIVGRP.com. We're running a training event upstate New York this summer. Go check out the website, see if you're interested.
If you want to be
in signing
cool
up.
like Jack, make sure you're there.
Yeah, man. You want to like have a beard and a ball cap. Yeah.
Little
Cool,
dead
man.
drop.
So, guys, thank you so much for joining
you.
us tonight. Next Friday, we're going to have a RRC guy on the show, Regimental Reconnaissance Company veteran on the show. Really excited to have him. Actually, he'll be joining us on Zoom. But Justin and Toby, thank you for joining us in studio
Thank
tonight.
you. Love the
Coming
studio.
out
It's
here to do
great.
that.
No, it's great. Thank you. Thanks again.
Yeah, you guys are welcome anytime, man. Anytime you need us, we're here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
everybody.
We'll see